Dr. Alan Meisel and Dr. Lourdes Relao. Of course, without the support of SETB and USEP, we are not all here. So I would also like to acknowledge the support of the College of Education and the College of Development and Management faculty, as well as the Office of the President staff and members. Of course, the support of our plenary speakers for these 2 days, they are all equally acknowledged. At this point, ladies and gentlemen, are you all aware, or are you aware, that the college education behind bars program inside the Davao City Jail is the only of its kind in the Philippines? Of course, we don't want to go there, but this is a very nice program, a program of SETB and USEP. Yes, this program was implemented by the Social Entrepreneurship Technology and Business Institute in partnership with the University of Southeastern Philippines. And SETB and USEP are more than happy to welcome you all to this international conference. At this juncture, let us listen to the welcome remarks of the President of SETB, Dr. Alan David Meisel.
Thank you. General Edwin Riel, Director of Inmates, Welfare and Development, BGMP National Headquarters. BGMP Regional Director, Dr. Kamaya Dayan. President, University of Southern Philippines, Dr. Henry Lau. And representing from Commissioner of Higher Education. And Dr. Pulanes, Manager of City Treatment Rehabilitation Center for Drug Dependence, and distinguished guests, and welcome and good morning.
Yeah, hi sir, welcome to you sir. We also have 2 participants from Camiguin Provincial. Yes, welcome. And we have from the Davao College Incorporated. We have 1 participant. Welcome. We have from RMC, Rizal Memorial College. We also have participants from Provincial Jail Agusan del Sur. Welcome to you, sir. We also have a participant from SPAMAS. Welcome, Paul. And of course, we're taking advantage that the first international conference is here in USEP, so we have also USEP participants. Alright, please rise so that everyone can see you. Thank you. And those people who are wearing red uniform in the back, they're from the University of Southeastern Philippines. We also have our participants from the Bureau of Jail and Management Penology, BJMP. And we also acknowledge the presence of our participants from the Department of Education. We have from Stella Maris Academy of Davao, our neighbor school. Oh, wow, we have a representative from VXI. Yeah, that's a call center. Okay, we also have from DMSC. And we have from OSC SPED, Special Education. We also have from the Iloilo Science, from ISAT University, Iloilo Science and Technology, all right. We also have from JRMSU Jose Rizal Memorial State University. Wow, thank you as well from PRC Davao del Sur. And we also have from RSU. Hello po. Alright, hello po. BPSU. Okay. AMICOR. Representative from AMICOR. And then we also have our representative from RTC Branch 13 of Davao City. We also have for PGO Jail. I believe you're still here inside. We also have a PGO Pandag. Live stream. I think this is a school here in Davao City. Live stream. PJMPTCJ. So I'm not sure with the initials. Davao City J ba ito? Okay, but we have two from the BJMPTCJ. I love her. We have also from Davao del Norte State College. From UIC, University of Immaculate Conception. And of course, we also have from the Commission on Higher Education. We also have from BJMPTCJ. You have all the initials there in the BJMP. Okay, we have also from the University of Mindanao, main campus. Of course, our friends from Set B. And Miss Obrero. Alright. And those that I have not mentioned, which I will recognize later, thank you so much. And welcome to the University of Southeastern Philippines. Alright. Okay. At this point, we shall have the first, or our keynote message for this, or presentation for this two-day conference. And our keynote speaker, let me introduce our keynote speaker. Our keynote speaker works at the intersection of race, crime, culture, and justice. And she earned her PhD in English from Columbia University, specializing in American and African American studies. She earned her PhD in English from Columbia University, specializing in American and African American studies. At John Jay, she is the founding academic director of John Jay's Prison to College Pipeline Program, which offers college courses and re-entry planning to incarcerated men at Oxville Correctional Facility, and broadly works to increase access to higher education for incarcerated and formerly incarcerated individuals. Her book, Incarceration Nations, A Journey to Justice in Prisons Around the World, published in 2016, was heralded by the New York Times, National Public Radio, and many more, and was named a notable book of 2016 by the Washington Post. Our speaker also moonlights as a journalist and critic, writing about Caribbean culture, race-related issues, travel, music, and pop culture for such outlets as the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, and Wall Street Journal. And she's also introducing on-air segments about music and global culture for National Public Radio. Together with the Oscar-nominated filmmaker Peter Spire, our speaker produced and wrote the two documentaries about hip-hop, criminal justice, and the prison industrial complex in the U.S. She regularly speaks about justice reform and prison issues on popular news media and international settings. And she was named a 2017-2018 Global Fulbright Scholar and is working on internationally to replicate the prison to college pipeline with a focus on the Caribbean and South Africa. Ladies and gentlemen, our keynote speaker for this international conference is no other than Dr. Baz Dreisinger.
Good morning, good morning. Hello everyone. Thank you, distinguished panel, sharing the stage with me. Thank you, Dr. Alain, for inviting me, Madam President, Attorney Susan, all who've gathered here today, all the distinguished individuals, and the individuals who are simply here because they care. That's a very beautiful thing. I myself am very, very excited to be here and thrilled to be back in the Philippines. I was here once about 6 years ago, 5-6 years ago, in the context of research for my book, although it was a stopover en route to Singapore, and I vowed that I would return because I loved the country so much and was struck by its beauty. So to be able to return in this context, a context so meaningful, so important, of such great, frankly, national and international relevance is a tremendous honor. So this morning, I wanted to take everyone on a bit of a journey around the world with me. My work, as was mentioned, is grounded in the U.S. prison system. The work I do at John Jay College of Criminal Justice is about education. I created a program called the Prison to College Pipeline Program, which I'll be speaking more about tomorrow, that has remarkable similarities with the incredible program here inside the prison. And as I've done this work in the U.S., the issue of mass incarceration has attained global relevance. It's become quite a mainstream subject, and there's been a great deal of recognition around the fact that mass incarceration is in many respects the civil rights issue of our time in the U.S. We have the largest prison population in the world, 2.3 million incarcerated. We have 5% of the world's population and 25% of its prison population. Some very shameful numbers. We spend 6 times on incarceration what we do on higher education. We spend over $50 billion a year on this industry. It is a crisis of epic proportions. And yet, while there is tremendous relevance to that reality and there's a tremendous crisis there, that still leaves 75% of the world's prison population. There are over 10.3 million people incarcerated around the world. More than 3 million of them have not been convicted of anything. And the work that I do, or began to do, as I proceeded to get more and more deeply involved in prisons, was about understanding this crisis on a global level. And I wanted to understand it not simply from a data perspective, but on a human level, understanding the narratives, understanding the connections between what is happening in prisons around the world, both in terms of the problem, but also in terms of the solution. And most fundamentally, and that's what I want to focus on today, is to rethink the very fundamental basis of a prison-based system of justice. What do we do when we incarcerate people? What are prisons all about? What is the history of responding to crime with prisons? And so I ask your permission to accompany me, if we can set up the slideshow, as we journey around the world and get a glimpse at a few countries' prisons that I visited in the context of my book, Incarceration Nations. And my hope is, in this journey, to not only get a glimpse of these particular countries, these specific countries, but also to sort of unseat some of the things we might take for granted when we think about prison, and rethink some of our fundamental assumptions. We can start with the first slide, which is Rwanda. And so I ask your liberty to sort of free up your mind and rethink, perhaps, some of the philosophical bases on which you consider the basis of prisons, really, and the basis of punishment. So speaking of the word punishment, I began my journey, which involved 9 countries around the world, in Rwanda, in East Africa. And I began there because essentially Rwanda is a country of victims and offenders as a result of the genocide that happened roughly 25 years ago. And I began in Rwanda because I come from the fundamental belief that one does not begin talking about crime by talking about the quote-unquote offenders, the one who have done harm, but rather one begins any conversation of crime by talking about the person who was harmed, the victim, the survivor, and what are their needs and how do we address them. And in Rwanda, there was quite a radical approach to the genocide that involved this, what is known as a restorative justice approach. An approach that says, how are we going to make this right to the victim, to the survivor? How are we going to right the wrong that was done, not through punishment, not through revenge, but rather through restoration and reconciliation? And so the government did this on a grand scale when it established grand courts known as the Gacaca courts, whereby individuals who committed genocide were given opportunities to make apology, and not just apology, but make reparations to the person that they harmed, and set up systems of payment that sometimes involved working on an individual's farm for 20 years, ways that they could work towards righting what was wrong. I personally was there spending time with younger survivors, individuals between 20 and 25, college students, university students, who were old enough to have been impacted by the genocide, but young enough such that their way of processing would likely be quite different from the older generation. And I spent time going into the prisons of Rwanda to establish a program whereby these young people could visit the individuals, the prisoners, 80% of whom are in for the crime of genocide. So we're talking about young people who are potentially visiting, without knowing it, someone who may have killed members of their own family, and engaging with them, conversing with them, singing, dancing, finding a way to create reconciliation. And I think the most profound takeaway from the time I spent in Rwanda, which shapes everything about how I engage and work in prisons, whether I'm in the Philippines, whether I'm in Rwanda or in the US, is that when we approach situations of crime, we must, number one, consider the needs of those who've been harmed first, put that at the centerpiece of our criminal justice system. And number two, we need to not make assumptions about what the needs of those crime victims are. We often assume that prisons, that revenge, that harming someone who did the wrong is going to somehow make the victim feel better or the survivor feel better. And what I have learned in my time in Rwanda, in doing research on this issue in the US and globally speaking, is that actually revenge does not bring the satisfaction that we think it does. That in fact, what victims desire are things like empowerment, restoration of their own respect, truthful answers, and especially restitution and reparations. So whenever I think about a justice system, the way that I gauge its success is most fundamentally by thinking about the needs of the survivors of harm and whether their needs are being addressed, or we are just assuming, as we do so often, that prisons and revenge and harming is going to bring someone the healing that that person deserves. I think too, and this is very important in terms of language, around the world we talk about departments of corrections. I've never heard of a department of punishment, although there were some prison systems, including the US, that used to be called a department of punishment, but shifted. We talk about corrections because, as I see it, fundamentally, and I draw many philosophers in thinking in this regard, fundamentally, punishment is a hypocrisy. What punishment says is, you did harm to someone, so I'm going to harm you in response. I view that as fundamentally hypocritical and the opposite of the sort of society we want to live in. Corrections is quite different from punishment. Correction says, you've harmed someone and potentially harmed yourself in the process. We need to correct that. And we need to correct the society that produced the avenue for you to create that harm and to harm someone else. You owe something to society, but mainly you owe something to the person you've harmed. It is your duty to make corrections, to make amends, to make reparations. And that again shapes everything about how I consider criminal justice systems to operate. We're about corrections. We're about reparations, repair, reconciliation, the most powerful words. I also saw this, next slide please, in the work that I did in South Africa, another country that is steeped in the language of what's known as restorative justice, that is steeped in thinking about a great trauma at its core, Singapore, which is the trauma of apartheid, during which blacks, whites, and what's known as the colored population in South Africa, the mixed race, predominantly mixed race population, were kept under a brutal oppressive regime for many decades of the 20th century. And prior to that, were enslaved. So you're talking about another country that has a tremendous legacy of harm at its core. And yet, in the context of this, and this is in Cape Town, this photo is in Cape Town, South Africa. It's in Colesmore Prison, quite a legendary prison. Nelson Mandela spent 6 years there. It's also a prison in dire conditions that look quite similar from some of the photos I saw in the documentary earlier. Like many prisons around the world, it's deeply overcrowded. It is filled with disease. The TB transmission rate is 90%. The government owes billions of dollars in